Hi, everyone, and welcome to our new season of Fossil Friday Web Chat. I am your host, Brittany Stoneberg. With me, as always, is Gabe Santos.
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
And today is our presenter is Michelle Barboza.
Hey, everyone.
Yay.
We're so happy to have you on the show.
Yeah, I know. We are all friends, and so this is really exciting. Our new season of
Do you have your audio on, Britt?
So, let's see. Can everybody hear me now? Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
I can hear you.
Awesome. All right. So let me go ahead and introduce Michelle. Michelle Barboza is a Latinx Los Angeles native who studies the history of the Earth. Their paleontological research is focused on extinct land-dwelling plant eating Miocene mammals. And their other projects focus on the need for accessibility and diversity in STEM. Michelle teaches at CSU Fullerton and Chaffey College currently, and also is the new co-host of PBS Eons.
Woo! Yeah, go Michelle.
Hey, Sam.
Awesome. So, as always, everyone, if you have questions for Michelle, go ahead and put that in the live chat. I know we're all dealing with the new format, having moved to YouTube, but we think this is going to be way more effective. So, if you have questions, we'll have a Q&A after their presentation. So, go ahead and any questions you might have during the talk, go ahead and throw them in there, and I will ask them afterwards. And Michelle, whenever you are ready, go for it.
Yeah, all right. So again, hey everyone, my name's Michelle. Let's go ahead and get started with this presentation. So first slide here is just a picture of myself with a little bit of background, what Brittany said. So I studied geology and paleontology for my undergrad and grad programs. And so my main focus had been on vertebrate paleontology and biostratigraphy. And throughout my undergrad, grad, and now current career, I've worked in both museums, science communication, and higher education. So museums, I've worked here in Orange County at the John D. Cooper Center. During grad school, I worked as a graduate research assistant at the Florida Museum of Natural History. And then for these past 2 years, I've also been working with the Natural History Museum of LA County. For science communication, I had my own podcast for a while talking about the history of women in STEM. So actually for grad school, in addition to a paleo degree, I got a degree in women's studies. I help run the Cosplay for Science group with Brittany and Gabe. And as we just mentioned, I am the newest co-host for PBS Eons. So videos with me won't be coming out for a while. As you may guess, we can't go into record at this time. But for live streams and other virtual events, you'll see me popping up from now on. And then in higher ed, like they mentioned, I'm a professor, a lecturer of geology and earth history. But today, what we're going to talk about is my work through the Natural History Museum of LA, running the Marine Science Teen Internship program. So let's move on to the next slide. Before I talk about the program, I kind of want to talk about where did it come from, right? So the Natural History Museum of LA is a pretty big museum, and we have lots of departments, and this particular internship is run through the mobile museum department at the Natural History Museum of LA. So like the Western Science Center, which now has their mobile museum, we have some as well. And we in fact have 2 different mobile museums. We have one that is based out of ocean information and one that is based out of archaeology and sort of the natural history of the Los Angeles basin. So they're very, very cool. And what they look like, as you can see on the next slide, is on the outside, they just look like regular 18-wheeler tractor trailers. On the inside, you're completely transported to an entirely new world. So on the ocean experience, which is what you can see in the this slide with the 3 pictures, it looks like you're inside a submersible. So students go inside and we have portholes, which are actually TV screens. And so each TV screen is synchronized. And when we start playing our dive, it will look like we are starting to dive underwater. And the screens are showing videos that were recorded off of the San Pedro channel here in Los Angeles. So it's actual real life footage from right off the coast. And we use that to teach students about the marine diversity here in LA. And that is partnered through the museum. So in the front half of the submersible, you have that whole submarine trip. And on the back half, we have our laboratory with real actual specimens from the museum in those jars of formaldehyde and alcohol and whatever it may be. And we've had our scientists from the museum record videos of themselves in their labs, kind of leading these students as scientists to explore the San Pedro Channel here in LA. So it's a really, really awesome program. And this program is provided for free to students in LAUSD, Long Beach Unified, and I believe Pasadena Unified School Districts through a generous donation, a generous grant through the Gluck Foundation. So this is what happens during the school year. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, hopefully this video starts playing. If not, I'm going to send Britt and Gabe a link so you guys can check it out as well. But during the school year, these tractor trailers are taken to schools, right? We have our ocean experience go to high schools, and our archaeology experience goes to middle schools. And these programs are about 2 hours each. So students spend about an hour inside the mobile museum doing a guided educational experience with our museum employees and our museum educators leading that. And then they also have a lab that accompanies that. They use some classroom in the school to go through. So it's about, again, an hour in the museum, an hour in school. The trucks are there for about a week per school, and they rotate. Great. If we move on to the next two slides, you can see, again, Mobile Museum Archaeology is for the younger grades. Mobile Museum Ocean is for the older grades. But what happens during the summer? And what happens to everyone else who wants to check out these mobile museums, right? Because they sound super cool, but if you're not in LAUSD or if you're not in Pasadena, how do you get a chance to see them? That's what the summer is for. In the summer, we use these mobile museums for our community events. And traditionally, we've partnered with Parks After Dark, which you can see in this next slide. It's the logo. Parks After Dark is not just something that's run through the Natural History Museum of LA. It's run through the entire county of Los Angeles. And what they do is that in our different parks, it's usually on the weekends, so Thursday through Sunday. During the summertime, they will have free concerts, free movies, free educational experiences through partnerships like the Natural History Museum of LA. So if you've ever gone to like your local park in the summer, if you're here in the city of LA and you see some fun stuff going on, that's probably put on through the Parks After Dark program. And so we have partnered with Parks After Dark to take these mobile museums out and let people come in and explore them. Now you may see a slight problem, right? The mobile museum programs are designed to be about an hour to 2 hours. Now, if you're hanging out at the park on a hot summer night with your popsicle, you're probably not going to want to sit down for an hour guided experience, but you do want to check it out. And we still want this experience to be interactive. We want it to be educational, and we want you to walk away feeling like you learned something, but also empowered to continue that learning. So this is what kind of sprung up this idea of the Marine Science Teen Internship at NHMLA. So if you look on the next slide, you can see this internship only started 2 years ago, so in 2019. And the main emphasis of it was we wanted teens to be the ones who were designing these programs that were going to be led at Parks After Dark. Not only to design them, but also to be the ones facilitating these programs. So in previous years, we had those same educators that went during the school year lead these programs at the parks. And that was super great, but we had this opportunity to expand the program and to get our local community involved. So this is a summer internship. It runs from June through July as a paid internship. And then we have our students as unpaid interns who are preparing for that paid internship during the spring. Now, these interns are high school students. They're juniors and seniors from the local LA area. So all our students are from Boyle Heights. They're from Felicitas and Mendez Gonzalez High School in Boyle Heights, and from the Math Science Technology magnet school at Roosevelt and Boyle Heights. So these schools are only about 5 to 7 miles away from the museum itself. And our interns are all first generation, usually low income students that have the opportunity to not only join our team as interns, but join our team as paid part-time employees of the museum, which is a really big pull, right? We understand a lot of these students may not be able to normally join an internship because they need to work in the summer and provide for their families, and we don't want them to have to choose. So through a generous donation from the Vera M. Campbell Foundation, we are able to pay our interns for their work in the summer. So they are official NHM employees. Okay, so in this next slide, I have the program goals, and they're very long and wordy, right, to get every detail. But in essence, there are 3 goals to this program. We want it to reflect marine science and natural history, to have our teens learn about marine science and natural history. We want our teens to learn about science education, and we want our teens to be involved in community engagement, right? So this internship, while it's called the Marine Science Internship, is not based on research or going out necessarily into the ocean to do collections. It's more about museums and natural history overall. So we're using the mobile museum ocean experience as our lens, as our entry point to understanding just museums in general, right? What is a museum, in fact? What do they do, right? A lot of people know a museum as, or our museum as, this old building that's next to USC that has dinosaurs. But a lot of people, including our students, didn't realize that it's a research institution, right? That it's not just this display of dinosaurs that's out in the hall, but that's only a fraction of what we actually have in our collections, right? In our warehouses. A lot of our students didn't realize that we also have education going on, like these mobile museums, right? So we want to teach our students about the local marine science and the local natural history of where we are based, which again is in LA. And then we want them to not only learn about it, but to be empowered to teach that to their community, which is where our science education and our community engagement comes in, right? So this is a 2-part process. And we're really adamant about the fact that these students are taking control and feeling empowered to not only share what they've learned throughout the summer at Parks After Dark, but continue to be community leaders, right, after they've left our internship. So moving on to the next slide, you can see here 2019, that was the first year that the program started, and I was on board for that. My official title is coordinator for this program, and it has been for the past 2 years. And so what I do is help recruit our students, interview, design, right, along with my team in the Mobile Museums Department at NHMLA. So 2019, we partnered with LA County Parks After Dark. We continued that programming, but this time with our teens being the ones that develop the program and that facilitate the program. And so what was really new and different about this was that we didn't necessarily know what the program was going to look like other than we provide these teens with the scientific knowledge that they need and the training that they need, and then they get to decide from there, right? We are a guiding hand, but this is their program as they design it, which makes it really, really exciting for both us and the teens. If we move on to the next slide, you can see that while this program takes place in the summer, right? The summer is when they are facilitating and going out to the parks. We start in the spring because they need time to, again, gain that scientific knowledge and gain the training that they'll need to create this program. So during the spring, students would visit the museum 2 times a month, once every other week. And while they did that, they were introduced to the exhibits, right? They were introduced to research at the museum. They got to see behind the scenes of the collections rooms. They got to meet everyone in our programs department and our education department, and spend time developing that program. Now, again, I mentioned that these students are local, right? They're 5-6 miles away. They're within LA City, not just LA County, but the city of LA. And yet, for many of them, this was their first visit to the museum. If not ever, then not with a school field trip, right? And so they had seen it and they thought it looked cool, but they hadn't really had a chance to really engage with the museum and understand Why is a museum important? What does a museum do for our community? How do I connect to this museum, right? This museum was built in 1913. It's beautiful. It's got like these marble halls and these big stone columns. And it almost looks like when we refer to that white academic tower, right? It's almost unreachable. It's got this air of reverence when you step in. Maybe you don't see it as a place for yourself. And I think that's how a lot of our teens had felt. A lot of them expressed that they were unsure whether they could apply to this program because they didn't feel that they were the right fit. And so a lot of what we wanted to do was show them that they are in fact the right fit for this program and that this museum is for everyone. It's for LA County by LA County. Another big thing that we wanted to get across with this program is that yes, we're a science museum, right? We teach natural history, we need our researchers, but there's so much more that goes on at the museum, right? We have our education department, we have a graphic design department, we have a web development department, right? And so whether you are more artsy or you're more into teaching or you just really want to get down and dirty with some pipettes, there's a little bit of everything of that going on here at the museum. And so if you love natural history, but you also love coding, you could do both, right? You don't have to choose. There's a way to fit all of your interests and all of your loves together here. So if we move on to the next slide, what you're actually looking at here is a flyer that our teams designed to broadcast the fact that they would be taking out the mobile museums to parks after dark for the entirety of the summer. So this is a 6-week program, and I call it a 6-week program because this is when they are actual part-time employees of the NHMLA. They work 3 days a week, 8-hour days, right? So a full part-time employment job, and they get paid for that, which was super exciting for them. On the days that they were not at Parks After Dark, we would either come to the museum and continue that learning experience where they got to do behind the scenes tours with our gardeners, with our live animal exhibits, with the collections exhibits, where they got to do a dissection of squid and fish led by some of our education team. Or we would go on field trips. So we went to the Aquarium of the Pacific and got to meet with their teen internship program, and they got to exchange stories about how they got started and what they were learning and what was useful. We also got to visit our other sister museums, right? So the Natural History Museum of LA the Natural History family also encompasses the La Brea Tar Pits and the Hart Museum. So we got to meet different aspects of the museum, different nonprofit institutions, and then actually just visit local areas throughout LA where you could explore nature, right? So LA, when you think of it, is very urban, right? It's a concrete jungle. A lot of people don't think of wildlife or nature or natural history happening here, but it is, and that's what we want to also impart with our students, a lot of them who don't live next to the mountains or live next to the beach, right? And I think I'll be talking about iNaturalist a little bit in a second, but teaching our students to slow down, open their eyes, and connect with the nature that exists even in a city like LA. So moving on to the next slide again, hopefully this video starts playing, but we can see a little bit of what the teens were experiencing as they were taking part in this 2019 program, right? So we visited tide pooling areas here locally, Rancho Palos Verdes. Shout out, is a wonderful place to go tide pooling. And in our teen reviews, a lot of them said that this was the first time they had ever gone tide pooling, but now they were super eager to take their parents, to take their family. They felt empowered because they could be guides now to their family, to their local community members, now that they kind of understood what they were looking at. And then they also understood that even if they didn't know what they were looking at, that was okay, right? It's okay to be wrong. We were very forthcoming that I didn't study marine science, right? I studied dead bone things, and yet it was okay for me to go out with them and use our guidebooks, use iNaturalist app to ask questions and be curious, right? And there's a system that we use at the Natural History Museum and throughout different museums called VTS. So these are visual thinking strategies. And we wanted to teach that to the students because as someone who would be facilitating during the summer, right, they could expect students, parents toddlers to be asking them questions that they might not know the answer to. And at first, that completely scared them, right? They might be showing a starfish, and what if a parent asked a question about a starfish that they couldn't answer? Their first reaction was, I'm dumb, I'm not good enough, I don't know how to answer this question. So we turned that on its head and thought about how can we turn this into a learning journey where both of us get to ask the questions and both of us get to explore, right? So when we're presenting our objects, they would ask questions that didn't necessarily have a yes or no, right? It's what makes you say that about this? Why do you think such and such thing, right? So teaching the students to not only be able to explore public speaking, but be comfortable with not knowing the answer to everything, because that's how science works, right? We continue to ask questions, and then those questions are what propel new research, new understanding. Okay, so next slide. Going into 2020, right? The program goals and the program plans were the same. Parks After Dark. This year we bring in the alumni from the previous years, starting with our orientation at NHMLA. And again, this was the first visit to the museum for most of our students. Now this year for our orientation, we made it a family orientation. And so we had the students bring their parents and their siblings if they so wished. And so the first half of orientation was going over what the program would look like. The second half was just allowing them time to explore the museum. That's one of the things we really learned and got a lot of feedback from our first year. We thought it would be so cool to take them behind the scenes, to take them on all these field trips, to do these workshops, which it was. But again, a lot of the students talked about how they hadn't had time to just explore the museum as is, these public facing exhibits. And so they wanted more time to do that. So that's what we did for this orientation, gave them about half the day to just explore, take it in with their family. And a lot of them cited that as their favorite part of the internship, was just getting that chance to be a part of the museum, both as an observer and as an employee. Now, on the next slide, a screen that I'm sure is familiar to all of you, right? This is, I believe, a video conferencing call with all of our interns and some of the people who made this internship happen this year, because after that first orientation, our students were not able to return to the museum, right? We had our safer at home orders. This is when quarantine started. And this is when we had to really rethink how we were going to lead the internship this year. So what really grounded us, what really helped out, was that we had the same goals, right? The goals were still learning about natural history, whether it's through marine science or just nature in LA, and how that connects to the museum, learning about science education and letting those students be empowered with what they learned from this internship to be able to teach it to their community, leading into that community engagement. So last year in 2019, the way we did that was by creating that in-person programming with the mobile museums. This year, we had to think, how could we accomplish those same goals, right? It didn't necessarily need to be in the mobile museum. So in that next slide, you can see how we started our internship from home was continuing, again, not only the same goals, but that same sort of format. So we had our guest speakers continue to come. This time it was through a video, just like I am speaking to you. We continued our workshops and our trainings and started learning about the process again of not just getting that scientific information, but learning how to translate, is what we would call it, translate that complicated scientific information into something that their friends and their family and their community could understand and care about. Moving on to the next slide, you can see an example of what these trainings and these workshops look like during the spring. So this is Michelle Race. She was my co-coordinator for the last year, and this year she is one of the managers for our community science department at the NHMLA. And so she led a wonderful training with our students on how to use iNaturalist, which, if you haven't used, is a wonderful app developed by a couple different museums, but used very heavily by ours, the NHMLA, where you basically tag out your phone. You can take a picture of whatever living organism you find around your neighborhood, and you can have either your community and or research scientists at the museum identify it with you. And so we use this time to think about how, even though we were stuck at home or maybe just with our front porches and our balconies, we could still A, find nature, and B, use that as a learning tool. Right. So this is just one example of how our workshops and our trainings continue to take place during these early initial stages of quarantine. As we move on to the next slide and thought about summer 2020, it became clear that our entire internship would continue to be from home with our students logging on and talking to us through a screen. So how does that still be meaningful, and how do we still produce something, right, for our students? Because again, goals are learning natural history, learning science education, and bringing the two together to create something for their community. So what we realized that the museum needed and a lot of people were looking for was virtual content, right? A way to still connect with each other, to connect with science from home. And some of that had started to pop up, right? Like our museum was creating virtual content for the web pages, but now we had these teens, so we could create something for teens, by teens, and for the general public by the general public, right? By our teens who are part of that community, who have these different questions that we might not have thought to ask. So on the next slide, you can see our interns were still paid this summer. They still had the same amount of hours. We just switched things around a little bit. So instead of 3 days a week, we did 4 days a week, and we did shorter work days. So our work days, our teens would log on through videos. Sometimes we would have them use Google Docs and Google Slides to communicate with each other. And so for this internship, while it was a goal last year to also give them work experience and really good transferable work skills, this year we certainly nailed that because they learned how to use email professionally, how to collaborate on group projects using G Suite, using all these other internet enabled or cloud-based operations, right? So again, guest speakers continue, workshops continued, trainings continued, and now the interns got to start planning again their own version of how they would like to share the science and share the natural history that they had learned with their communities. So here's an example of one of their earliest crafts and one of their earliest projects. We started learning about Pacific marine life, right? Again, this is the Marine Science Teen Internship. So after their initial trainings, they kind of picked what had been most interesting to them, and we thought, how could we translate this to a family, right? A family who might be at home right now, who doesn't necessarily have access to a bunch of fancy craft materials, and who may not have access to a scientist that's able to talk to them at the museum, or an educator who can talk to them in the park. And so one of the examples of this is our interns thought that the giant Pacific octopus was the coolest thing. And so using some streamers and balloons that they had at their own home, created a craft where while you are making an octopus using this balloon and streamers, you learn about the biological properties of the octopus, and you learn that, hey, they might live off of the very shore, only a few miles from where you are here in LA. As we continued and moved forward throughout the semester, you can see here, sorry, not the semester, the summer, you can see here on the next slide that they got a little bit more intensive about how they were teaching, right? So in this case, they created an entire lesson plan that we are putting up at the NHM website through our school and teacher programs that can be used in high school biology classes. So they actually got kind of into the weeds and looked at NGSS, which are our next generation science standards. They got to learn about why they were being taught, what they were being taught in school, and how having this goal of what do we want our audience or our families to walk away with will inform how we create our craft activity or our lesson plan activity or eventually our video activities. And so here are just two examples of these lesson plans that our teens came up with. One was about keystone species and kelp ecosystems, right? So at the Natural History Museum, we have many different departments that are associated with marine science. One of the ones that they thought was super cool was understanding how kelp ecosystems are a balance, and so they created a game where you have an otter and a sea urchin and kelp, and what happens if you have too many of one species? What are the repercussions that you will see in the ecosystem? Another example was doing an oil spill lab where they modeled what an oil spill would look like and what it takes to clean it up, and then they connected all of that back to the museum and educational materials that we had there, which was really awesome to see how they did that. On our next slide is a video created by our teens from their homes during this quarantine time. So we were able to get them loaning technology from our museum. If they didn't have already a laptop or a web-enabled device, we sent them out just a ring light, right? And using a ring light and their own cell phones, they created this video. Now, this is just one of a couple different videos that they created. I don't want to share all of their final crafts because they are still going to be rolling out through the NHM website and our partner websites. So I can't spoil the surprises. But what I'll tell you is that they continued to learn about marine science and think about how they could connect it to people at home and to younger audiences. And so they chose SpongeBob from Nickelodeon, right? SpongeBob has marine animals. What is the actual true science behind SpongeBob? What kind of SpongeBob characters might you find in our local oceans, at the museum, at the NHMLA? And so they had a chance to learn a little bit of video editing skills, a little bit of recording themselves skills. We had a performing arts workshop where they learned how to talk to a camera, which if you've ever tried can be a little bit hard. And so they were the ones who came up with the idea to create these videos and accompanying crafts that go with the videos. The videos introduce you to the science. The craft lets you get hands-on and do the science from your own home, right? So I think one of my biggest takeaways was just how much these teens were capable of. Again, this is just their phones at home, iPhones, Androids, and a ring light, which if you don't have one, you could just use a tabletop light pointed at you, right? So on the next slide, an example or a list of all the different types of trainings, workshops, and guests that they got to meet with during this summer internship. So that iNaturalist training I talked about, digital engagement, right? What does the website look like with the NHMLA? What are different ways that we can connect with people using social media like YouTube Live or Instagram or using Instagram stories, right? They got to learn the trainings for each of our mobile museums, even though we didn't take them out. We are the mobile museum department, and we've used that as a method for science communication, right? Communicating the sort of really intense research that's going on into a way that our community can connect with. They got to meet with our researchers from ichthyology, from community science, from archaeology, from paleontology, our Marine Biodiversity Center, right? So everyone, all the scientists, all the researchers from our departments were interested in participating. But again, not just our research departments. We also met with people from education, from exhibits, from graphic design and web development, right? And so our students were able to learn that even if they didn't want to become, let's say, the next museum researcher, that didn't mean that the museum at science isn't something for them. So if we move on to my last slide, which is the why does the Marine Science Teen Internship matter? Why should we be teaching younger students about natural history? Well, again, I started off with what is even a museum? I think a lot of people don't understand it's not just a display, not just a curio cabinet of curiosities, but a place for research and education, right? That's something completely new to them. And then our students said it helped them understand, what does the museum do for the community? So at the NHMLA, we do a lot of community science. We get a lot of our local schools and our local people involved in iNaturalist, for example, when they are taking pictures of the squirrels, even that they see in their backyards. That's data for our scientists at the museum to be able to understand the biodiversity of our own city, right? So you can be a scientist, you can participate from your own home without a PhD, right? Without all of the fancy equipment that we have at the museum. Also, what can the museum do for the community, right? If we are just museum employees talking amongst ourselves, we can lose sight of what the community needs or is interested in or doesn't know exists as us being a resource. And then finally, well, not finally, but one of the big things too was how can I get access to the museum, right? I talked about the museum being inaccessible in some cases where they didn't know that there were free museum days, where they didn't know that the museum, if the museum's too far away, will come to a park near you during the summers, right? And then our teens walked away from this being educators. So again, even if they are not interested in becoming a paleontologist or a collections manager, right? That doesn't matter. Something that Gabe told me once that I found so inspiring was we don't need every student to become a paleontologist, right? We want students that are going into business, that are going to become lawyers, that are politicians, that understand science, that understand why it's important to do research, that even if they don't understand it, feel empowered to learn more about it, right? That they don't see it as something scary, as something that they can't Google and ask questions about, right? So opening up our students' mindsets, and then they in turn being able to share that with their families and their local communities to ask these questions. So again, we don't need to create the next paleontologist or the next curator. We just need to inspire the curiosity in these students and their communities to feel empowered to ask questions, to do some research, and to be able to change their minds, right? And so that is essentially the Marine Science Teen Internship at the Natural History Museum of LA. Again, we're a baby program, only 2 years, but I'm just so inspired by what these teens have created, both in our in-person version and our virtual programming, right? Giving these teens just a little bit of attention, a little bit of tools, and seeing what they are able to create, letting them dictate our program. With that, I'd love to open it up to any questions.
All right.
Great. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, guys.
Of course. So one question from Jennifer Bauer. For someone trying to start a similar internship program, what would you recommend be their first step? Funding, project outline, partners?
Yeah, so I was not on board for the funding and the initial founding of the internship. I was brought on when the internship had already been run through the grant process and was already in the works. I came in when they were interviewing the first round of students. So I can't speak to that as much, but what I could talk about is you don't necessarily need a lot. If you have the funding, right, and you can pay these interns, awesome. But for example, during our summer internship, in 2020, we sent out students ring lights and they did the rest with their phones, right? We talked to them over video conferencing. That's free, right? You can still give students so many interesting opportunities without necessarily having to spend a fortune on it. But if you can get that money, then I'd say what that money is going to go towards, what our biggest costs were for this program, was when we were going out to the different parks, right? That's off-site from the museum. We wanted to pay for these students' transportation because they're underage, so a lot of them didn't have the means to get themselves to these parks or to the museum. So that would be something to take into consideration, even if you're not paying them, right? Sort of those external costs. But a big thing that we talked about or that we thought about during this summer as well when we were kind of having to redevelop and reimagine this internship was what were the needs of the museum. And so for us, one of those needs, not just for the museum, but sort of for everyone, was this virtual engagement. Teens are super tech savvy, teens are super into this. And so letting them kind of tell us what they thought would be interesting was awesome. You don't need to have sort of this is our ABC structure and teens are going to do what we tell them to do, is letting it be a conversation, right? They are fully capable functioning if you give them the tools and the opportunity to do so.
Yeah. That's actually been, I think, our experience at the Western Science Center as well. You know, while we've been closed, our teen volunteers are still meeting with our educator, Dr. Brett Dooley, working on 3D printing, learning more about research. So, yeah, Michelle is right. You don't need all the accoutrements. I think you just need to be able to teach them.
And a lot of kids or teens and students, they're like ready to like do these things. You just got to give them the opportunity. Like at our high school, a lot of our students they will take things so fast and take charge once you give them a project. There is nothing saying like oh, this is too hard, I don't know how to do it. They're so tech savvy and they learn things so fast that once you're like, hey, we want to make a video for the museum, you give them like the idea and they'll do everything. It's great. They're so awesome.
Yeah, we didn't teach them how to video edit. We didn't teach them how to film. We had a sort of how do you do a public speaking and how do you talk loudly and how do you write a script beforehand. But all of their editing, that was them. They figured it out. They did not even ask for help. They were like, we got this. Just give us a week. We'll get back to you, you know. So I think that's awesome. Also think about what needs again do you have at the museum. Do you need to scan digital fossils? Is there like some sort of community science thing that could be happening, right? I've sometimes heard of these internships referred to almost as a burden because it's like extra work. Don't make it extra work. Make them the help that you need for the work that you already have.
Yeah. I it's for me it's kind of funny too because like I remember when I was in high school, I did not have that level of tech savvy, I guess. I mean, I learned a lot, but like trying to make videos and things like that was a whole different process, I think, than it is today, where like this is kind of intuitive and just kind of part of the norm for a lot of students nowadays. I sound so old. I should stop talking. Um,
Well, do you have any
yeah.
additional questions, Gabe?
Yeah. So, Michelle, for I know a lot of people might be wanting to wonder, for someone who started their career as a geologist, paleontologist, how did you make that transition into education?
Yeah, accidentally and on purpose. So my parents are both teachers. They're middle school and junior high teachers, and I swore I would never be a teacher ever. And now they won't stop making fun of me because here I am. Um, but when I was in grad school, I loved being in the collections. I loved working with the fossils. I loved doing the research at the beginning. And then I realized, okay, this research is fun, but what I really want to do is tell people about it because it's so exciting, right? And sure, when you're doing research, you talk to other researchers and you get very deep in the weeds, and that can be exciting. But as someone who personally did not enjoy science, right? I hated science in high school. If you ever told me I'd be a scientist, I would have laughed in your face because I thought, like a lot of these teens, that science was inaccessible, that it wasn't for me. I wasn't good at math. I'm still not good at math, not the best at writing. And so it just didn't seem like something for me. And then when I started college and I realized that you could get paid to dig up dinosaur bones and go hiking, I was like, all right, tell me more. Let's explore. So I got deep into science and I went to grad school and started doing this research, but I realized what I was missing was talking to people about it, people who didn't know how cool science could be and that there are fossils underneath your feet, even here in LA, right? I wanted to share that. And so I started doing that through formal education, right? So I'm a lecturer right now. I teach higher ed, but I also got involved in a lot of these science communication programs. So luckily, my undergrad and grad schools were both connected to museums. And so my jobs in undergrad and grad school were working at those museums and helping basically again translate this crazy science into something that people could not only understand but get excited about, right? And so it kind of was always there in the background. I got really lucky again that these partnerships already existed, and even though now I'm a lecturer and I'm in formal education, I love doing stuff like this where I get to talk to maybe people that wouldn't have taken a science class, right? Because the only students I'm getting right now have to take my science class. Um, Cosplay for Science, which I do with Gabe and Britt, is kind of that same thing, right? We go to Comic Cons where people are not thinking about science. Maybe they're thinking about the next superhero film. And then we get to say, okay, but what about the real physics behind your superheroes? And just kind of sneak that science and sneak these interesting connections to them. I love that. The sneaky science. I'm all about it.
Sneaky hashtag sneaky science.
For those of you who don't know at home either, me and Michelle met because I was starting my master's and Michelle was in her undergrad at Cal State Fullerton. And so that's how we met, and we both started kind of our science communication, science education path around the same time too. I remember conversations we had where we're like, oh, I don't know, maybe this is what we want to do, and then like now we're just like, this is what we're doing full time.
Awesome.
So I got one more question for you, Michelle.
Okay.
For somebody who is interested in paleontology, but they're kind of thinking about maybe education might be for me too. What kind of tips would you give to somebody who's interested in getting into science communication and science education, but also trying to work on the science at the same time?
Yeah, well, you definitely don't have to choose both, is the biggest tip. What I ended up doing was I did my master's in paleontology because I wasn't totally sure if I wanted to commit to a whole PhD program. And I'm really glad I did that. It worked out for me because in grad school, I also got the opportunity to do teaching as a TA. While I was doing my research side, I had those whole 2 years of like serious research, and I was like, cool, I'm glad I did that, but that's not the direction that I'm interested in going. And I was able to get that background of TAing. Another really big thing that I'm sure Britt and Gabe have talked about here too is volunteering at your local museums, right? Right now, maybe you can't volunteer in person, but it's still worth reaching out to them and seeing if they need any help, or if they could keep you in mind for future events, right? Because when you start to volunteer in a museum, you again are getting to see the research that goes on there, but you also get to do that education side of it. So science communication and science education are almost the same thing, right? It's talking to people who don't understand the science about the science in a relatable and an accessible way. So you can totally do both. You don't have to choose. There's also, organizations like Cosplay for Science that look for help, and you can start blogging about it, right? There's so many different outlets right now, even though we're sort of shut down and at home. I started that podcast that I mentioned. It's not on air anymore. I stopped paying for it, so I don't know if you can find it. But I did that because I was deep in my paleo research, but I was interested in education. So that was my sort of fun side experiment to see how I felt about it. And I loved it. So you can do something as simple as on your Instagram, share science facts, right, to the people that are following you, or start a science blog and talk about the cool fossils that you learned about, right? It's sort of a no stakes way to stretch those muscles and practice that. And by the time that you decide, hey, I actually am interested in research or education, you have almost this like wonderful resume that you've built out for yourself just by having fun.
Well, now we can see why Michelle is the new co-host of PBS Eons, which, by the way, when do we get to see you on there? Can you say it yet? Is it secret?
Oh, we don't know. Thank you, COVID. We were supposed to start filming in April 2020. And so when it's safe to go into the recording studio again is when that'll happen. We have some live stream events coming up, and I'll certainly let you guys know. But right now, we're just kind of on hiatus, waiting to see when it can happen.
Well, I'm excited to be able to see you on that screen.
I am too. I use them in my actual classes when I'm teaching. So now I'll have really nice production videos for my classes.
Double dip.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for sharing about all of that. And thank you to all for joining us. Just a quick reminder, everybody, if you would like to support either of our museums, the Western Science Center and the Raymond M. Alf Museum, who partnered together to bring Fossil Friday chats every week, there'll be information on how to do that. And Gabe, I think you had some closing remarks.
Yeah, so like Brittany said, thanks everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our channel for all the upcoming Fossil Friday Chat episodes. We've got links to Michelle's Marine Science Teen Internship in the link, and you can find out more about our museums there. And we also want to say thank you to webcaptioner.com for providing our captions here today. And so thank you, and we'll see you all next week when Ana Valenzuela Toro joins us to talk about a really cool case of an southern elephant seal from Indiana. Sorry. Bye, everybody.
Bye.